Lying hasn't done Boris Johnson's career much harm so far, but now he's telling porkies about deaths in care homes. Could it finally do him some damage? Plus, is it woke to have a coronavirus cleaner? Dalia Gebrial is here. She's an editor at Novara Media, and we will be discussing both of those crucial questions later in the show. How are you doing, Dalia?
I'm doing all right. I have been cooped up for a very long time because I live on like this insanely busy road. So I feel like I can't go out for like nice long walks like they are in the country. So I'm a bit like, ugh. But we all have to do our bit. So
no balcony?
No, I stick my head out of the window like a dog though sometimes.
Oh wow, that does
Just
sound
feel the
rude.
breeze on my face.
Before we get to those important stories, though, it's been a big week in the economics of coronavirus, with Rishi Sunak extending the furlough scheme and Treasury officials drawing up plans for a new round of austerity. The left needs a sharp analysis and a solid response. And who better to get on for that than former Shadow Chancellor and intellectual giant of the left, John McDonnell?
Oh, my goodness.
How are you doing, John?
All right. Stop doing those sort of build-ups with you. It's ridiculous.
Well, I was thinking, I'm a bit disappointed because this is the second time we've had you on the show from home, and we still haven't seen those wonderful curtains that Andrew Marr gets in the background.
Yeah, I'm from my study rather than the front room. Shall we talk about this week?
Yeah, we'll do that in a moment. First of all, tweet your comments on the hashtag TiskiSour and share the show link. We want to get more people watching this. All right, yeah. So, John, yesterday, in response to reports that the furlough scheme might be reduced from 80% to 60% of incomes, you tweeted that Sunak would be starving people back to work. So in the end, he announced a 4-month extension to the scheme with workers entitled to the full 80% until October. So my first question to you is whether or not that announcement has allayed your concerns.
On the tweet, if you look at the tweet itself, I said if accurate, if as reported, because we need to understand the technique that Rishi Sunak and Dominic Cummings use on these announcements. What they do is, and it's nothing, no new political device. In fact, most politicians have done it in the past. They float an idea to see how far they can go, and that's been a consistent pattern right the way through the coronavirus process when dealing with Sunak and with Number 10 as well. So last week, and they usually what they do is they brief usually the right-wing media, the right-wing press. They plant a story, see what reaction there is, see how far they can go, and then they'll make their move. So on this one, they briefed the right-wing papers that there was a potential of there'll be furlough extension. We knew that was going to happen. And we knew it'd be about 3 or 4, maybe 5 months. But also they briefed to test the water on whether or not they should immediately reduce the intervention level from 80% to 60%. The reaction, what was very interesting, was that the reaction across the piece was pretty strong. And I was really pleased that actually the unions held together very well, including the TUC. But also quite across the piece as well. And I think even on their own backbenchers as well, they were getting a fair amount of lobbying, and including places like Federation of Small Businesses and others. So I think they pulled back and held to the 80%. Problem is, and this is the problem that they've got now, they did nothing about the self-employed. So the self-employed scheme comes to at the end of this month, and there was no announcement on that. There will be almost certainly, because all the way through this process, getting the government, getting Sunak in particular, to announce something, it's like drawing teeth. You have to really push them and push them and push them, and then eventually you'll get something, and then usually within about 48 hours you realize there's huge gaps still left. So I think they'll have to come back in the next week or so to make some statement for the self-employed, because there's quite a bit of backlash that they were excluded yet again yesterday. Then the other issue, which is the second element of the announcement yesterday, is that they will review at the end of July, so the first week of August, whether or not employers should make a contribution towards the wage support scheme, the job retention scheme. Now, what that signals is basically I think the real threat that there'll be quite a significant round of redundancies. And I think a number of companies have already seen, like British Airways, are already edging towards quite dramatic numbers of redundancies as well. That's the fear we've got. So the cliff edge now is he may well announce that the scheme is going to continue on until October, but by actually effectively reducing the government rate of support in the first week of August, demanding that employers make some additional contribution, means that unless there's some legislative protection for workers, there'll be, I think, quite a large round of redundancies. And the other issue then is, which is most probably maybe the other more important kite that's been flown, was the specific briefing that was given to the Daily Telegraph about the potential for, as you say, another round of austerity measures. Interesting enough as well, people did pick up on it fairly quickly. You know, the fact that we'll be out again tomorrow clapping the nurses and the carers and the public sector workers, and yet in that briefing, which was supposedly a leaked report, but was obviously provided to the Telegraph, they were talking about 3-year pay freezes for those workers. Also talking about triple lock guarantee for pensions being smashed as well. So pensioners being hit quite hard, and other forms of austerity measures, including tax increases. So I think what they did is that classically, it's the Cummings Sunak type technique, briefed a right-wing paper, get it out there, see what the reaction is, and then they'll test just how far that they can go. I think the wiser heads amongst them are not going to say there's no point in us going ahead and arguing for straight up austerity. I think they're more likely to couch it in a combination of sort of a form of right-wing Keynesianism where they'll continue fiscal stimulus, but it'll be directed to support big business and corporations. But at the same time, they'll still argue in this sort of the metaphors and the similes and the analogies they use about people tightening their belts, etc. And they'll still argue for elements of austerity as too, but it'll be disguised in many ways by the fiscal stimulus they'll still be giving the economy, but that will largely be sustaining profit levels rather than increasing wages or protecting wages.
What do you think Labour's line should be on the short-term debt that's going to be created by the coronavirus crisis? So in that briefing, I kind of agree that sort of the specific policies that were announced, that was kite flying, but the idea that there's going to be a £300 billion deficit, that's realistic.
Yeah.
So should Labour be arguing that we shouldn't worry about the debt because we can do monetary financing, we can print money? Should they be saying because interest rates are so low, we can just borrow and not really worry about it? Or should they be talking about taxing the rich to pay the cost of the crisis? I mean, how do you think they should be approaching this?
I think there's a fairly straightforward. You look at a long-term plan which recognises that actually, of course, you'll need to borrow, and you'll need to borrow at some scale. And that's, the interesting thing about all of this is that there's no shortage of people willing to take that borrowing. There's no shortage of people willing to take up government bonds and gilts, etc. So I think that's the cheapest way of doing it, and it most probably will give the steadiest response in the markets as well in the long term. But also, you've got to recognise that if we are going to have the long-term investment that we need to not just stabilise the economy, more importantly, it's about looking to the next crisis, which is the climate change crisis. So therefore, you'll need a fair taxation system for that, and the fair taxation system has got to be linked as well to the fair distribution of rewards and the creation of wealth within our economy. So there's a whole new debate to be had now that Labour will now lead, I believe, which is about making sure that the argument they'll put forward is someone's got to pay for this crisis. Well, that's the wrong form of language we should use. What we're talking about is having a longer term economic plan which addresses the whole range of issues that we have to address. And we're not at a crisis level or anything like that. Yes, there'll be large amounts of debt as a result of this. We take that in our stride. We combine a whole range of measures in which we can tackle that debt, but more importantly, build and maintain demand within the economy, of course. But that's also got to be directed at, as I say, the existential threat that we face. The most important thing that we've got to be saying, people now, the tragedy of the deaths and the human suffering has been immense over these last few months. And we've got to completely understand why people are focused on that, and we've got to focus on saving lives. But we've now got to edge people into facing up to the potentially bigger crisis now, and not be distracted from it. And that's the challenge I think politicians and all of us have got, of let's building the narrative about how we move into that.
So when you were Shadow Chancellor for almost 5 years and Jeremy Corbyn was leader, both of you, I think, really shifted economic discourse to the left, sort of argued that states need to invest and austerity doesn't really work. In the last month or so, it sometimes seems as if Labour are almost following when it comes to economics. So just on the furlough specifically, I think Starmer had called for the furlough to be extended in certain sectors. Sunak ended up announcing it's going to be extended in all sectors. So, I mean, do you think there could be the genuine danger now that the Labour Party get outflanked to the left when it comes to ambitious economic interventions?
Yeah. Let's just go through the history of this. And I'm sorry if I'm blowing my own trumpet here, but sometimes you need a bit of this. We actually, where did the furlough scheme come from? It actually came from us. It came, when towards the end of February, beginning of March, before the budget, we were arguing for a comprehensive program to tackle the pandemic threat that we thought we faced then. And if you look at the speeches I did, and when you look at actually at that point in time as well, I was tweeting out particularly around learning the lessons of the bank crisis about having a global response rather than individual state one. But then we submitted paper after paper to Sunak. Before he announced the furlough scheme, we'd put our proposals in, and we weren't particularly original. We were looking at what was happening in Denmark and elsewhere, where we were saying 100% protection of wages, but 90% from the state, 10% from the employers, and making it conditional on the employers paying their 10%, between 10 and 20, depending on the level of the wages that they were supporting. But we were also saying at that point in time, quite dramatic increases in support mechanisms like sick pay and the benefits, and also for those on existing benefits like carers allowance, especially, because actually the carers allowance would be key to supporting the carers, family carers largely, in dealing with the crisis, because the increased levels of vulnerability, particularly of older people and people with disabilities. So we put forward a fairly comprehensive program. We also put forward proposals around self-employed and a review of all departmental expenditure to make sure that they had the resources they needed to meet with the growing challenge. So actually, we were ahead of the game. And what was, I think, what infuriated me at times, because I was having conversations with Sunak, I put in a tweet last night, it was like drawing teeth. You'd put a proposal up, you'd have the conversation, and you'd wait and wait and wait, and then something came out which was a half measure. And you'd say, look, you're going to have to move further and faster. And then eventually did. And during that period, the trolling and the attacks on me and us and Labour Party in the media was unbelievable. It was almost as though we were betraying the country in times of war. It was, any form of criticism of what Sunak was doing. I can remember when he made his first announcement on the Friday evening, 5:30 he finished, and within half an hour I was doing a response. And I simply said, I welcome what he said, but it isn't fast enough and it's not big enough. It's not on the scale needed. I got a tsunami of attacks in the media and on social media. Within a week, he was going to the next stage, which he should have done in the first place. So all the gaps we identified, he was having to fill. And even some of them, like new starters, he still hasn't, unfortunately, supported them. And not really, I think, supported the self-employed in the way he should have done. So I think we were ahead of the game. I think it's moving on now rapidly. I think Keir is doing a good job in, the word they use about him in the forensic analysis of what the Tories are doing. And I think he's exposed their weaknesses and failures. But I do think we need to be a bit more leading edge. I think we do need to be a bit more dynamic. There has been a setback as well. The housing policy that was announced was a real setback on rent in particular, because Jeremy Corbyn did write, I think it was about March 17th or 18th, to Johnson saying we wanted rent suspended. And we could have a conversation about how that would be paid for, whether it fell on landlords or whether it fell on taxpayers generally or whatever. Let's have that conversation. But actually what was happening, our worry was that people were getting themselves into debt. Yes, we forced them to suspend evictions. That was our proposal. But we were saying, actually, as that debt builds up, the pressure on people would be enormous. And as soon as you ended the eviction ban, that's when the evictions would start. But in the meantime, people would be under intense stress, and it would cause mental health problems. And unfortunately, this last week, the party has gone back on a bit of that. But, I was at meetings this evening and this afternoon where, for example, Acorn and the London Renters Union and others are meeting with Thangam Debonair, who's the Labour housing spokesperson, and they're lobbying like mad now to say, look, we do need a proper suspension of rents. And let's talk about the mechanism for how that's paid so that we can lift pressure off people.
And so do you think that position probably won't hold? Because, I mean, when it was first announced, we've talked about it on the show, that it almost seemed like Labour in the Miliband era, where you're saying the poor will still have to pay for the crisis, but they'll pay for it over a longer period of time than what the Tories are offering. It seemed like kind of back to the bad old days, didn't it? Interesting
enough, I was just on an earlier Zoom meeting, and someone actually said this is Milibandism, isn't it? And actually, I think the one thing that Ed Miliband did learn from that period, because remember, Ed was battling Ed Balls. That was his main problem. I don't think Ed had complete control of the situation because he had those sort of forces within his shadow cabinet. I think the lesson from that era is that you have to be more decisive and clearer. And it is a bit about whose side you're on as well, and be very, very clear. And we've got to be very, very clear that we are on the side of renters, who at the moment in this country, I think, get a particularly bad deal in comparison to what happens in other countries around Europe. And if you remember, one element of Jeremy's policies was around rent controls as well. And we won the argument on that to the point that when Sadiq Khan, who for a long while was skeptical about rent controls, when he launched his campaign for mayor, when the elections had not taken place, but when he launched it this year, rent controls was the key policy that he advocated because the housing situation is in such crisis in London in particular. So I think we'd won those arguments. It's a bit of a retrograde step to go back at this stage. But I think the momentum in the party, certainly amongst party members and amongst our supporters, and particularly with those campaigning around housing, and there's quite a number of think tanks as well as campaigning organisations, I think we'll be able to retrieve that to a certain extent.
I'm going to bring Dalia in 1 moment. First of all, we've got 1,700 of you watching the live stream. We want to get over 2,000, so make sure you share that link. Dalia.
Hello, how's everyone doing? Yeah, I thought that was a really interesting conversation. I guess, so in my work, I look at sort of gig economy workers, I look at platform workers, and I basically look at how bosses are basically evading the costly business of having a workforce by simply not calling their workers workers and doing all of these like legal maneuvers to avoid taking accountability for their workforce. And for me, what's happened with the self-employed situation during coronavirus and the fact that basically it's an intensification and a culmination of the fact that so many workers who are largely infrastructural workers, the people that keep our society going, predominantly migrant workers as well, are just falling through the cracks of systems that are set up to protect workers, things that have been hard won by trade unions for decades. And I guess my question would be, both in the short term and the long term, is what do you think the response of us as progressives, as the left, as unions, should be to the fact that an increasing proportion of our workforce is kind of falling through these gaps and therefore not accessing their rights and entitlements in times of crisis, but also during regular times as well?
I think there's two issues there. And I tell you what was really interesting at the beginning of this crisis as well. I was getting briefed by various trade unions, IWGB, particularly with regard to the gig workers. And what was interesting, and you can see it on some of the films of the question times in the House of Commons, when we were raising questions with the Chancellor about people in the gig economy who were falling through all the schemes he put forward, we raised this issue about Limb B workers, definition of the definition of a type of worker that is largely in the gig economy who are barely protected. And it was interesting. I looked at Sunak's face when I raised it, and he clearly hadn't heard the expression. And I thought, my God, I realize now a bit more what I'm dealing with. I'm dealing with people who've never come in contact with this sphere of activity other than maybe having the pizza delivered at their door. And I thought, what we've got to do now, and I wasn't being in any aggressive way, we've got to educate these people about what's happening out there and really what the practical policies that are needed to try and support them. And I wasn't doing it in any way which was condemnatory. I was simply saying these are the categories of people out there who are falling through the gaps in the schemes you're putting forward, congratulating him when he brought forward a scheme, but at the same time saying this is how it's got to be amended. And I think that's interesting how that occurred, because you increasingly realize that actually the Tories literally did not know how this economy was working in reality on the ground for large numbers of people. That's the first thing. So as we went, then that's why I was getting frustrated, because they were bringing forward these schemes. The mainstream media were heroizing Rishi Sunak as, he's spending all this money and he's wonderful, fantastic, compared with Boris Johnson, who wouldn't be. But, he was bringing forward these schemes and everyone was congratulating him. But we were scratching our heads saying, well, actually, no, literally millions of people in this economy are falling through, nearly 1 million people on 0-hour contracts. And he never included part-timers in the scheme from the beginning. It was just ludicrous. And we were raising these points. Not the media weren't taking them up, but we managed to get some negotiations going. What do we do now? I think every time there's a group of workers or a representative organization that is raising these issues, either by way of campaigning, publicizing, or legal actions, the way the IWGB are taking legal actions, that you just automatically support and you get behind them, because the more of us get behind them, the more people understand what's going on. The second point is that we've got to make sure that people understand that we do have a reform program for employment rights in this country, which comprehensively would deal with most of these issues. And the program that we had was developed by the Institute of Employment Rights, and the three people that through the IER that developed that program, and we launched their sort of mini manifesto about 2 years ago, and we incorporated that into the Labour Party manifesto, and it's still there. And they've been working with the various unions, etc., to make sure that it's updated, relevant, and it's a program of legislation that could be easily brought forward. What we need to do now is start taking elements of that and popularizing them as particular specific demands as we go into this next period of crisis. And the reason I think it could be quite effective is because large numbers of people now who maybe weren't affected by the insecure economy that we have now have been. And it's interesting, the number of people who are waking up to the fact now, because sick pay is so low. And I think a large number of people who never before had experienced the levels of benefits or sick pay in the past now have woken up to say, actually, you can't live off it. And then they realize how limited rights you've got. And at the moment, the best example at the moment, they're now being told they've got to go back to work. Who's going to make sure that workplace is safe? Because the HSE, Health and Safety Executive, has been cut to ribbons over the last 10 years. You'll be lucky if in your working existence, if the HSE undertakes one inspection on a site that you're working on in your whole working lifetime. That's how bad it is. But in addition to that, who's going to speak up for them if they don't join a trade union? So again, all of those issues, I think people have got the opportunity. I think our people are learning about them, but we've got to be more forthright in offering the solutions, if you like. But we put in the House of Lords, we want to abolish the House of Lords, but whilst it's there, we need people in there. We put in John Hendy, QC, we're working with the Institute of Employment Rights, who's the person who specialised in the development of our employment rights programme. And again, it might be worthwhile getting him on the programme, because he can take through people some of the detail of this legislation that we require. but in a way which demonstrates that actually you can transform the working life for most people.
I think we have had John Hendy on. With
Have you? Oh, brilliant.
I think so. We're always one step ahead of you, you know.
You are.
Final question from us is, before we talk about lighter things, is Starmer's having a bit of a honeymoon at the moment. We're going to talk later about the fact that I think he kind of destroyed Boris Johnson at PMQs today. But also, I mean, the media are being quite nice to him. They're being nicer to him than they ever were to you and Jeremy Corbyn. And do you think that this is, so my question is, do you think that this is going to be something that lasts, or do you imagine them turning against him in a similar way that they, well, I mean, you and Jeremy Corbyn are kind of a different kettle of fish in terms of your politics being more oppositional to the establishment, but in the way that they turned against Ed Miliband? Or do you think that do you think there's something different going on here because he's knighted, because he was director of public prosecutions, etc.? How do you see the treatment of his leadership developing over the coming weeks, months, years?
Yeah, interesting. People, I was looking at because they've been publishing the approval ratings for Keir today compared with Johnson, and Keir's done very well. But actually, there were periods, believe it or not, when Jeremy's approval ratings were pretty good in comparison with Theresa May in particular. And then when the media, the mainstream media, saw that Jeremy might well be a threat, of course, they turned on him. They did the same with Ed Miliband. They did the same with Neil Kinnock. And inevitably, if the mainstream media consider that Keir is in any way a threat to the existing establishment, of course they'll turn on him. And the issue for us as the Labour Party is, how do you ensure that you protect your best you can against the damage that they can level against you, the damage that they can create? And the lessons from Jeremy's period is, and we went through it all, what resources have we got? Well, in terms of the mainstream media, the reality is the bulk of it will come at us no matter what. But what you need to do is make sure you're professional in the way that you deal with that. There's always lessons to be learned about that. And I'll just give you one example. Right the way through even from the GLC days when we were attacked at the GLC, one of the lessons that we learned is that actually use live broadcast media as much as possible. Because at least, even if they edit it after the live broadcast, at least you'll have had maybe 2 or 3 minutes to try and get your argument across as best you can, and try and do that as skillfully as possible. That's the first thing. And the other thing is, try not to lead with your chin. So make sure that actually you're minimizing the potential damage you're inflicting upon yourselves, but also make sure you've got a very strong rebuttal operation going on. In some ways, I don't think we were as effective at that between 17 and 19 the way that we should have been. So that's a lesson to be learned. And I think Keir's learned that lesson. The other thing as well is to have a strong narrative all the way through. And again, up until 2017, we've discussed this before, our strong narrative was anti-austerity. From 17-19, once you had Brexit hitting you, you had to have a much stronger narrative, either on Brexit or Brexit and something, and a stronger narrative to overcome just the sole Brexit issue. And I think that's where we failed, and that's an admission. So the lesson for Keir now is to build up as strong a narrative as possible about what he's about, or what the party's now about. And I think that's got to be resolved fairly quickly, because an election will be honest. You'll be surprised in politics how quickly elections occur, and you need to get to a situation within the first 18 months of a new leadership where you've got your strong narrative and your whole operation in place, because then you're into a general election campaign virtually for the last 18 months then of your period of administration.
Well, let's hope he's listening. I still haven't had confirmation as to whether or not he watches Tisky Sour, but I mean, I'm sure he will be.
I'll ask him.
Yeah.
What you should do is send him a few copies of what you've done so far and entice him on. He'd be quite good, actually.
To be honest, he might not like the lot. I think we've treated him quite fairly, but the lot.
I think you have.
We did
I'll
one
have a chat
critical
with
video
him
this week about rentals, but I think it was fair.
No, well, but give him his due. He'll take it on the chin where he does. I'll have a word with him, because the other thing you see. That was the other thing as well. We were very creative in Jeremy's campaign in using the whole range of media. Because, mainstream media, we knew we had to be more professional. We knew we had to have a strong narrative. But the one thing we had in 17 in particular was the dominance of social media. We lost that between 17 and 19, largely because I don't think we were creative enough, but also because massive investment by the Tories. They realised social media was important to them. And it wasn't just the election campaign, it was right through. They really invested heavily. And the thing about Keir's operation is to recognise he'll be in the same position. Use every platform you possibly can. And I think I'll mention Novara to him, because I think I genuinely think that there'll be an openness to some element of recognising you've got to go beyond just the media round from 5:30 in the morning, then winding up on the Today programme to be nailed and all that stuff. Yeah.
John, it is always such a pleasure to have you on for your analysis. We're going to keep doing it every time there's a big economic story. Yeah. We'll have to let you go, John, but we'll get you back on soon. It's brilliant to have you on.
Okay, nice to see you, Gebrial. Okay, cheers.
We're lucky to have John McDonnell, aren't we?
I know. It makes me emotional every time.
Right,
but yeah, no, we've got him back on the streets now, which is good.
Yeah, but to be honest, he never left the streets. To be
that
fair
is true.
He was,
That's why we love
never
him.
far from a protest, even as Shadow Chancellor. On to our next story. And we've often complained on this show that the country's political editors have been applying a light touch to the Tories' catastrophic handling of COVID-19. But another group of TV personalities have, perhaps surprisingly, stepped into the void to hold the government to account. They are the hosts of Britain's daytime TV. Let's take a look at Philip Schofield grilling Health Secretary Matt Hancock on ITV's This Morning.
When it comes to parents, we've been separated for such a long time that if you're actually asking us to pick a parent.
One at a time, Philip. So you can see one and then you can see the other, and that's fine. And another thing we're looking at is whether two households can come together and interact a lot more, but we need to do some more science on the impact that would have on the spread of the virus.
Can I see my parents like 10 minutes apart?
Yes, so long as it's only one at a time, that's fine.
But don't you see that that's utterly bonkers?
No.
No. It's a great response there from Matt. But I mean, that's obviously Philip Schofield. He's not a normal critic of the Conservative Party. So him and Holly Willoughby, the co-host, were very widely criticised actually before the 2019 general election for giving Boris Johnson a very soft interview during the election period. I think we can probably get a picture up of the selfie they took after that event. Great. They look so cozy, and now he's saying it's bonkers. Before we're going to discuss this at the same time, though, as we discuss the next clip. So as we mentioned on Monday's show, Philip Schofield hasn't been the only critic. So also Piers Morgan has been playing a blinder when it comes to holding this government to account on this particular issue. We should add, we're not complete Piers Morgan converts here. But anyway, this is him on Tuesday's episode of Good Morning Britain challenging Edwina Currie.
You say it all makes perfect sense. Why can a cleaner come into my house several times a week, but neither of the two sons I haven't seen in 10 weeks can do the same? Explain to me.
Right, because your cleaner's supposed to be cleaning and making your house a much healthier place, making sure all the surfaces, the doorknobs, the toilets, everywhere else, anywhere else.
So one of my sons is a great cleaner. He can do that. So why can't he do that?
Fine. Well, your
you
son's a cleaner, that's lovely.
Okay, so you think my youngest son is a good cleaner, he can come and do that job?
Let's come back to people going back to work.
No. I want you as the epitome of common sense. You've just said to me that my youngest son, who's a good cleaner, can come into my house. As long as he does a bit of cleaning, he can come and see me. Is that what you just said?
You are haranguing me. If you are going back to work...
I'm just literally repeating what you just said.
You can have your cleaner in your house.
Can it be my son, Edwina?
Is important.
Can it be my son?
Your son is important. People from two different households, you're starting to take the risk.
Yeah, I know all that. Can my son come and clean my house? Yes or no?
Then you understand it. I'm sorry, you understand it.
No.
You're just
is it a yes,
Edwina,
though?
just a straight yes or no. You like a straight answer. can my son, who's a good cleaner, come and clean my house and I see him in my house?
Yeah, I would have thought so.
Yeah,
That seems common
see,
sense.
now that's where you're applying your common sense. Unfortunately, that's completely against the rules that have been set by the Conservative government.
My favourite bit is you can have a cleaner because cleaning is important. Your son is important. It was a very interesting political interview. To be honest, retired politicians are often more entertaining than ones who are currently standing. But I mean, there are a couple of serious points to comment on there. So I think Philip Schofield's, I suppose, intervention was entertaining. But to be honest, I think the Tories are on more solid ground there, because if I was Matt Hancock, what I'd say is, look, we've got to draw the line somewhere. And wherever you draw the line, it's going to seem a bit arbitrary. So at the moment, we've said one person. If we said two people, then you'd say, well, what about if I want to visit my son, his wife, and their kid? Am I allowed to do that? You know, so say wherever you draw the line, it's going to be arbitrary. The Piers Morgan one, not even less defensible, absolutely outrageous, because that's not arbitrary. That's about valuing the relationship between an employer and their employee over the relationship between a parent and a child. And it tells you everything you need to know about the sense to which the Tories' easing of this lockdown is all about enabling the continuation of companies to make profit, and has very, very little to do with our well-being and the necessity that we have to be close to people who we love.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of a testament to how low our faith in the media as an institution that is supposed to hold power to account, that when a daytime TV, like, bear in mind, broadcast journalists are barely doing this, but when like a daytime TV host, you know, gets angry with the government for the fact that we literally have one of the most developed economies in the world, yet one of the highest death rates in the world, and that we're vastly exceeding other comparable countries in terms of our population density, etc. That this is you know, we're kind of so surprised that it's so newsworthy that these daytime TV hosts are taking them to account for this. I think it kind of shows how kind of starved we've been of any kind of real critical media, especially in relationship to the Tory government. Yeah, I think that I actually do agree with you that I think the Philip Schofield point was a bit strange. I would kind of expect to say that you can have a limit of maybe 2 households that can mix together. That kind of like, I don't think the arbitrariness of that is actually that arbitrary. Like, this virus works, the more kind of like units that it's passed between, the more of a problem it becomes. But the Piers Morgan issue, what the Piers Morgan issue shows is, firstly, that the safety of particularly working class people, people who at one point were called low skilled workers, then they were called key workers, now they're back to being low skilled workers. But ultimately, the people who do very essential infrastructural work, whether that's care work, whether it's delivery, whether it's transportation, whether it's courier work, whether it's all these different kinds of work, are basically, their safety and their value and the way that they are waged, the ways that they are protected, does not correspond to how essential they are to the economy. Because if you took Piers Morgan's scenario of having his son come and clean his house, that would be a lot more safe than having a cleaner who is cleaning multiple households and then going back to her own household, which apparently the Tory government does not consider a domestic worker's household to be a household, does not consider the fact that that domestic worker might also have vulnerable members of their family, etc. What the issue here is that the government does not want to continue paying a furlough scheme or continue supporting the low-wage essential workers that sustain our economy and that sustain our way of life. And that is really what is coming through here, because either it's unsafe for someone to go between 2 or more households, in which case no one should be going into any other household that's not theirs, or and that, you know, therefore we're sacrificing kind of the lives and the livelihood and the healthcare of cleaners and domestic workers, or it is safe to go between households, in which case family members should be able to see each other. So we know that it's the former. We know that this is about trying to limit the number of people that the government is liable for, particularly the people who are at the bottom of that chain, the people who are kind of most disrespected and most alienated, as we heard from John earlier. You know, these people don't occur to the establishment as people. So I think that kind of basically, essentially what we are seeing here is a kind of frustration with this idea that we are supporting and subsidizing and helping the working class and trying as quickly as the government possibly can to wash their hands of the need to cover the wages of domestic workers and other essential workers that run our economy.
I mean, I think that's such an important point. And the way, I suppose, unsurprisingly, this debate has happened in the media is saying, how come I can have a cleaner around my house, but I can't have my son around my house, right? But there's another way of framing it, which is how come a cleaner is expected to visit 20 people's households in one day, but is not allowed to visit their their friend's house, one family member's household for 8 weeks. So we're expecting them to go to 20 houses a day, but not visit their mum for 8 weeks for some, it doesn't make any medical sense whatsoever. The only possible way you can justify that policy is because you, as you say, you don't want to have to support workers. So you'd prefer to put them at risk. You'd prefer to put them in danger. We are not going to talk too much about this before we go on to our next topic, because it's also on a very much related topic in terms of the morality and the ethics of well, in this case, employing a cleaner over this particular period of time. Before we do that, make sure you like this video if you haven't already, and make sure you subscribe to the channel. I want to get us up to 100K by the end of the summer, I think is my challenge. Next story. So on the issue of cleaners going back to work, a big row was started today on social media by what else? A tweet from Owen Jones. So in response to Theo Usherwood, political editor at LBC, tweeting this: by allowing somebody into your home to do a job, you're helping to keep another household financially viable. By inviting your grandma over for a cup of tea, you're not. Sorry to go against the grain, but it is really as simple as that. So Owen Jones then replies to that tweet with this: so declaring something simple doesn't make it so. If someone can afford a cleaner, they should be paying them to stay at home and doing their own cleaning. They've certainly got the time to do it. Otherwise, they are a shockingly selfish human being. So, as much as I love Owen, sometimes I do find the shockingly selfish kind of entertaining to read. But in any case, this got picked up by Sarah Ditum. So she's a writer who often appears in the New Statesman and is famous for complaining about trans people. I think that's mainly what she writes about. So she quote tweeted Owen saying, I don't have more time in lockdown. I have less because I'm sharing my workspace with 2 teens and another adult. There's more dirt because of the more people. The cleaning is killing me. And this is a bad take. Now, the thing that might stand out for you there is this inappropriate turn of phrase that cleaning is killing her, because at the moment, cleaners are literally being killed, not just figuratively being killed because their house is messy. But anyway, before we get on to that serious issue, I want to look at a few more bad takes in this ridiculously out of touch thread. So Janice Turner, a Times columnist who, again, is quite famous for complaining about trans people. It's a bit of a common theme here. She says, although seemingly unrelated, it's odd. Anyway, she says, no one is forcing them, talking about cleaners. People are making arrangements so their cleaners are safe, providing gloves, anti-bac, and staying out of the house whilst they are there. Believe it or not, many people, even cleaners, actually want to return to work. It makes them feel useful and normal. I mean, the paternalism there stinks. Also, even if you make your particular household a safe space by going out, even though you're not really supposed to go out, I suppose what you do, go to the park for an hour or something, people still have to get there, and buses are full at this period in time. So it's not really safe. 2 more tweets. So Dighton then comes in. One thing I'd have expected Owen to understand, given he made his name busting the ugly work-shy chav stereotype, is that work is a source of independence and self-esteem for a lot of people, and many are dissatisfied with handouts. Now, if she'd have read Owen's book, she would have sort of noticed that handouts is not a particularly progressive way of talking about state support for people, especially in the middle of a pandemic. I mean, handouts are a ridiculous phrase to use. And the final one I'm going to go to before going to you, Dalia, then Caroline Criado Perez. She comes in response to the pushback that Janice Turner and Sarah Ditum have got. So Caroline Criado Perez, she's an author who campaigned to have women other than the Queen on our banknote. She intervenes to say, and now the inevitable, why are the mean women pointing out the massive female-shaped gap in my shoddy analysis? So my question for you, Dalia, I think this is all quite ridiculous. Is there a gap in my? Is there a female-shaped gap in my analysis? Am I missing something here?
So I think that the characters involved in this situation are incredibly embarrassing. However, this is actually a really important issue. Work is a really important feminist issue, and I think it's often either overlooked or not really spoken about very well, or spoken about in very limited terms in kind of public coverage of feminist debates. You know, this idea of women's work as being a feminist and very political issue. Essentially, I want to preface all of what I'm saying by the fact that whilst obviously I sort of come on the side of Owen, etc. right now, that cleaners, you know, private domestic workers should absolutely not be going to work right now. They should be supported in the way that other employees are being supported by a furlough scheme that protects their ability to keep themselves and their families safe. However, I do think that this whole kind of, like clean your own house or like sort of language neglects the fact that I think that a big contribution of feminist thought has been that domestic work, care work, and this kind of work that takes place in the private sphere is work, and it's work that should be waged. The problem is that the way that it is treated is either it is done for free by often very overworked women who have to also go into the public sphere and waged work, or it's done by hyper exploited, very poorly waged. You know, we know that domestic workers are paid well beyond poverty wages in this country, and often face a lot of abuse and lack of protection at work as well. So the problem, there isn't a problem with paying for this work. The problem comes with the fact that the work is paid so poorly, and the workers are treated so poorly and are not protected by sort of conventional employee rights. But I think actually, the question, when you said sort of like there seems to be an unrelated connection between the fact that these are really famous transphobes and they're also kind of neglecting to understand that the fact that white middle class women have leaned on the work of migrant and women of color and working class women in order to be able to sort of progress up the career chain as like, you know, a kind of particular capitalist feminism you know, puts as its primary aim is that women should be able to achieve what the men of their class achieve, and ignoring the kind of exploitation that happens to women who are racialized and classed under those women, women who enter into like the corporate workforce. I think there's a deep connection between the fact that the feminism of transphobic, the sort of so-called feminism of transphobic people, it basically has this very limited idea when they talk about women or women's issues or, you know, female shaped gaps or whatever they're calling it now. Their conception, what they imagine in their conception of woman, is very, very limited. It is cisgendered women, it is citizened women, it is women who come from middle class or upper middle class backgrounds, it is white women, and they just doesn't occur to them that women outside of that category are also women that should be affected and included in a feminist vision. And in fact, not just included, but actually at the center of a feminist vision. So what we are seeing now is the hilarious takes that what's truly feminist is to employ another woman as your cleaner, because that makes you a female boss and job creator, and that migrant women just live to clean your toilet. It makes them feel necessary and useful, which is so insulting that I actually can't even cope with it. But basically, what we are seeing here is kind of working class, sort of like liberatory and anti-capitalist feminism coming to loggerheads with a really bourgeois sort of liberal kind of feminism. So what I would say is, in the context of this pandemic, it is absolutely related to the fact that the people that do domestic work are disproportionately migrants, they're disproportionately women, people who have less social and economic and political power than the women who are tweeting this from their homes. And therefore, that translates into less protection, less safety, and less wages. So basically, Owen is right, but we should also not belittle the fact that domestic work is work and that running a household is really fucking hard, and the increased care and domestic work, particularly being taken on by working class women during this pandemic, shouldn't be sort of belittled or dismissed, I think.
That's a really important point. I'm going to very briefly lower the tone with what was my favorite sort of funny response to this particular row, which if you've seen Parasite, you'll understand. So we can get that tweet up now. So it is the completely, obviously out of touch rich woman in Parasite saying, so then Owen Jones said, can you believe it? He said that we should pay our cleaners to stay home. And then you've obviously got the working class guy there in the front who's sort of going slowly, getting slowly more and more annoyed at this family. But now we're going to move on to something very significant and important, which is the actual stats here. So obviously, yeah, this is in large part a story. Well, it relates to feminism and I suppose cleaning, whether or not you're in a pandemic in a way. But this also relates to this broader argument, which is that it is in workers' interests for us to loosen the lockdown. And this argument is made about cleaners. It's also made about construction workers, this idea that, you know, we should make people free to go back to work, not recognizing that there's often, well, always a lot of pressure to go back to work, whether or not that's economic or because your boss is demanding you do. And the stats here are black and white in terms of who loosening the lockdown is going to hurt the most and who it already is hurting the most. So this is statistics from the ONS, so the Office for National Statistics. So we'll go to first graphic. The major group with the highest rate of death involving COVID-19 was elementary workers, with 21.4 deaths per 100,000 males. So that's 225 deaths. The occupations in this group include those performing mostly routine tasks, such as construction workers and cleaners. The major group with the next highest rate was caring, leisure, and other service occupations, 17.9 deaths per 100,000 males, or 72 deaths, which included occupations such as nursing assistants, care workers, and ambulance drivers. Now, that's not the total, that's from their sample. So that's not necessarily the total number of people who've died in those occupations. That's from their sample because they're working out proportions of people. And now I want to get up the next graphic. So this is in terms of women by occupation. How likely are they to die from COVID-19? And you can see that professional occupations, so that's the journalists in this thread and the kind of people like Toby Young who'll be talking about how we should loosen the lockdown so that people can get back to work. They're not particularly at risk of COVID-19. They're under the average. Then you go to people working in the care sector, people working in low-skilled elementary occupations, way above average. And then if we go down to men, and the situation's even starker here, actually, you can see there that professional occupations and low-skilled elementary occupations. I don't like the word low-skilled to describe these occupations, but that's how it's described in the statistics. They are 4 times more likely. So if you are someone like a cleaner or a construction worker, you're 4 times more likely to die from COVID-19 than someone in a professional occupation. So when you see journalists like Toby Young, like Daniel Hannan, arguing, or people like Sarah Ditum arguing that it's liberatory for people to go out and to work and clean other people's houses, it's not those people who are going to suffer from a loosening of the lockdown. When people die from coronavirus, it is going to be overwhelmingly, and it already is overwhelmingly, people who work in frontline, low-paid jobs, which after this crisis, we better start paying a hell of a lot more. Hopefully, because, you know, finally we can get society to value those jobs to the extent that they should be. Final story for the day. We've complained a lot about the policy stances of Labour under Keir Starmer, whether that be on rent or on Kashmir. But at PMQs today, the new Labour leader absolutely destroyed Boris Johnson. He asked precise questions about the tragedy the Tories have overseen in care homes, and Johnson could only respond with bumbling evasion, or in 2 cases at least, outright lies. Let's go to the first clip from today's PMQs.
Mr. Speaker, in his speech on Sunday, the Prime Minister said that we need to rapidly reverse the awful epidemic in our care homes. But earlier this year, and until the 12th of March, the government's own official advice was, and I'm quoting from it, it remains very unlikely that people receiving care in a care home will become infected. Yesterday's ONS figures showed that at least 40% of all deaths from COVID-19 were in care homes. Does the Prime Minister accept that the government was too slow to protect people in care homes?
Prime Minister.
No, Mr. Speaker, it wasn't true that the advice said that, and actually we brought the lockdown in care homes ahead of the general lockdown.
So that last part was true. It's not particularly relevant because even though the lockdown was brought in earlier in care homes than the rest of society, it was still way too late, which is why so much coronavirus was able to get in. But the specific lie, the outright lie, was when he said government advice wasn't that outbreaks were unlikely in care homes. He said that wasn't the advice. Unfortunately for Boris Johnson, the receipts are online and available for anyone to see. So let's get up graphic 10. So this is from the government website. So it's not, it's not hidden anywhere. Guidance for social or community care and residential settings on COVID-19. So published the 25th of February, withdrawn 13th of March. So remember, Keir Starmer said this was the advice up to the 12th of March. Now we can look at the guidance. This guidance is intended for the current position in the UK where there is currently no transmission of COVID-19 in the community. It is therefore very unlikely that anyone receiving care in a care home or the community will become infected. This is the latest information and will be updated shortly. Now, what happened after that PMQs was that Starmer probably had a pre-prepared letter which was sent to Boris Johnson saying, can you please come back into the House of Commons and correct your lie when you said that wasn't the advice. In response, Downing Street, Boris Johnson's team, have said, no, the problem was Starmer took it out of context because he didn't mention the part that said this is the latest information and will be updated shortly. The problem with that argument is, yes, it did say this is the latest information and will be updated shortly, but it wasn't updated until the 13th of March. And you can see from the ONS data that is way too late. There was already rampant coronavirus in society and in care homes because the government have been slow on this. I want to now take a look at lie number 2.
The Daily Telegraph this week carried the following quote from a cardiologist. We discharged known, suspected and unknown cases into care homes which were unprepared, with no formal warning that patients were infected, no testing available and no PPE to prevent transmission. We actively seeded this into the very population that was most vulnerable. Does the Prime Minister accept that the cardiologist is right about this?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I have the utmost respect for all our medical profession who are doing an extraordinary job in very difficult circumstances. But what I can tell the House is that actually the number of discharges from hospitals into care homes went down in March and April, and we had a system of testing people going into care homes, and that testing is now being ramped up across all the 15,000 care homes in this country.
So what you saw there, Keir Starmer, again, very good strategy, very good tactics for PMQs, because what he does is he reads out a quote from the Daily Telegraph, which is the paper that Boris Johnson used to work at. So it's very difficult to dismiss that as some kind of left-wing propaganda. And the point he made, or the point that the Telegraph article made, was also an incredibly important one, which is that the government said that we need to protect care homes, but what they actually did was sent people back from hospital into care homes without testing them, literally seeding coronavirus in those spaces where people were most vulnerable to it. It's completely outrageous. But let's focus on Boris Johnson's response. So he said there, what I can tell the House is that actually the number of discharges from hospital into care homes went down in March and April, and we had a system of testing people going into care homes. Now, again, how do we find out this is bullshit? We look on the government's own website. It's not difficult to find. So the government did have a system of, so it turns out the government did have a system of testing people being discharged from hospital into care homes, but not until the 15th of April. He's implying they had it in March and April, right? Let's get up this section from the website. So the government to offer testing for everyone who needs one in social care settings. All care home residents and social care staff with coronavirus symptoms will be tested as capacity is built up, the government is announcing today. This is a government press release. Then you can see at the bottom, published the 15th of April 2020. And we can go to the content of that press release. All symptomatic care home residents will be tested for COVID-19 as testing capacity continues to increase. This is the really important one. All patients discharged from hospital to be tested before going into care homes as a matter of course. So that was not happening before the 15th of April as a matter of course. And all social care staff who need a test will now have access to one. So by the 15th of April, already 8,000 people had died from COVID-19 in the UK. And as on average, it takes 23 days between catching COVID-19 and dying from it. That means we were in a really, really late stage of the epidemic. You know, you look at the curves every day. We were really high up that curve. Coronavirus was absolutely rampant in the country at that point in time. And the Tories, the government, hadn't even been testing people going from the place where coronavirus is most widespread, which is our hospitals, going straight from those places into the places where people are most vulnerable, which is care homes. And I mean, obviously, as a policy, this is completely outrageous. But also, what you're seeing there is Boris Johnson managing to lie in a space of about 5 minutes in front of the country. And my question for you, Dalia, is that Boris Johnson lying hasn't really damaged his career up to now. That seems to be something that people have priced in. When for example, at the last general election, the Labour Party tried to say, "Oh, don't vote for Boris Johnson; he's a liar." It didn't really work. What I think could change this, though, is he's not now lying about his past position on Brexit or lying about what he did or didn't write in a newspaper 20 years ago. He's lying about people dying in care homes, right? And this is older people, or people with older parents are also in the Tories' target group. So this isn't like, to be incredibly cynical about it, this isn't like Grenfell. These are the people who are dying from coronavirus are people who, the Tories give a shit about because they vote for them. So do you think that him being so blatant in his disregard for the lives of people in care homes is finally going to come back and undermine his political career? I mean, I've given up trying to predict elections, quite frankly. But I think that, what the strategy of the Tories right now is to kind of try and weasel their way through things by talking about technicalities, right? So the thing about, capacity to test rather than how many people are being tested. But Boris Johnson at PMQs was trying to kind of weasel his way and say, oh, well, we were testing before, and then we, the number of discharges went down and much. If you had as a way to kind of pretend that this is all under control, we're doing the best that we can, et cetera, et cetera. And it's like, if this was all happening and if everything was under control, why are 40% of the deaths in care homes? Like, simply the reality and the kind of technicalities that the Tories are trying to rely on are just completely fissured from one another. I think also, as well as looking at older people, I also wonder how this will impact sort of working class people that turned to the Tories in the last election, how they will kind of reckon with this, because we know this is also deeply affecting working class people. But fundamentally, this all goes down to how this is going to be narrativized. So essentially, will this be narrativized as a kind of, oh, the government was doing everything that they could, but, the UK is very specific. It can't be compared to other countries, which is what the kind of Tory line is. Is it going to be rested on personal responsibility? Fundamentally, that is the issue. What I think that we should be pushing is the reality, which is that herd immunity, they've stopped using it as a tagline, but ultimately we know from the leaks from Dominic Cummings saying at a dinner, just as this crisis was beginning to sort of dig its claws into this country, very casually saying that we should allow it to move through the population, and if a few pensioners die, then so be it. And it was as black and white as that. And I don't remember Boris's ratings going down after it was said in such black and white terms. But ultimately, some kind of strategy of herd immunity is still being deployed. It is not being talked about, but the whole system of trying to undo the lockdown, of trying to release people back into unsafe conditions. Germany is lifting their lockdown right now, but they're lifting it firstly after having locked down way earlier than than we had. And also,
they have very strict regulations to ensure that everyone who needs it is provided with PPE. You cannot get on a train right now or a bus without a mask on. We simply don't have the infrastructure or the apparently political will to implement that kind of safe easing out of lockdown. What we are seeing is a herd immunity approach, which is that if some people, whether they're vulnerable people, whether they're working class, whether they're elderly, if they have to lose their lives in order for us to try and get the economy going again, that is simply the price that we are willing to pay. And I think that that is the argument, and using kind of what the fact that even Piers Morgan is talking in these terms, that is the kind of the kind of message that we should be very, very clear about. I wonder kind of how much this kind of technical nitpicking really grabs the British population as much as a kind of very big narrative of, is herd immunity the secret policy that is actually being pursued by this government? And I think there is evidence to suggest that in some form it is.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right there. And I mean, you could say, I think Keir Starmer was brilliant at PMQs. He put forward some great arguments and caught Boris Johnson out. Getting him to lie on the spot is very powerful. But actually, I think the most powerful way to make the argument that the Tories aren't actually trying to suppress coronavirus is just to show someone a video of people piling off a London bus this morning. Because if you had a government that cared about suppressing coronavirus, they would not be piling people on buses without PPE. Some of them have masks, but some of them don't, because you haven't made it a requirement and you haven't really, given people a way of getting these masks. Then you wouldn't do that if you didn't have as part of your plan or built into your plan that this virus is going to spread through the population. It wouldn't make any sense otherwise.
Yeah, 100%. And I think, and again, I think that whilst, Keir Starmer was effective at PMQs, I think what we need to look at is more kind of, what I thought was really important about the conversation with John was it's the opposition's role is not just to expose the governing party, but it's also to use the fact that it does have a position of relative power in order to push real action. It's difficult because sometimes the governing party then gets the credit for it, but we are also in the business here of trying to save lives. And that is really, really important. So I think that, it looks to me like herd immunity is pretty much the unspoken rule when it comes to the government policies right now. Because they just don't make sense otherwise. Because countries that have successfully contained the virus have followed pandemic response strategies that were developed by British scientists. The difference is that they actually implemented it, whereas our government didn't. So it's not like we don't have the knowledge and the resources. We just don't have the political will. And I'm not sure that we have the infrastructure because of how much austerity has gutted any kind of centralized public health measures as well.
So at this point in the show, I normally read out your comments and your tweets. I'm going to do something slightly different today because we got a really lovely email from someone called Bill in Faversham. So he said, "Hi guys, because I don't do social media, I don't appear on the radar, but thank you. I'm aged 69 and appear to be totally at variance with the politics of most of my demographic. I wouldn't creep up on you and say that at a bus stop. You are doing fantastic and necessary work. Long may it you continue. I do donate quietly, but obviously not on screen." Thank you so much, Bill. And we do appreciate so much everyone who is donating, who is subscribing, and who, doesn't necessarily use Twitter. Also, we do have, I'll read out one super chat as well. So Danielle Khan with a $9.99 super chat. Please make sure the content stays this regular. We will be going live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday for the foreseeable future. And a $9.99 super chat there. Thank you very much. We'll be back on Friday at 8 p.m. So make sure you hit subscribe so as not to miss that. Dalia Gebrial has been brilliant. We'll get you on back super soon, Dalia. You've been watching Tysky Sour on Novara Media. Good night.